In this presentation, we're going to be discussing Anderson's Chapter 26, Writing Reader-Centered Feasibility Reports. There are a few learning objectives within this presentation. The first is understanding and describing the goals of feasibility reports. The second is explaining the structure of feasibility reports and how the elements you're discussing and designing align with the reader's questions. The third is adapting the reader-centered writing process and implementing it when writing the actual report. And the last one is going to be knowing how to write a feasibility report. So to start, what is a feasibility report? It's the way in which the results of a feasibility study are presented. Feasibility reports serve as a supplementation of studies that are provided to a company to justify or discourage the action steps the company is looking to take. So there's going to be two features of feasibility reports that you're going to want to note. The first is that when decision makers are considering their alternatives, they tend to ask the same set of general questions. These questions should assist in the creation and execution of your research and writing processes. And the second is that feasibility reports are often prepared, a set of successful conventions have developed surrounding their content and organization. So likely they're going to be the same styles and formats and things like that every time you're creating one. Before beginning, there's a few questions that are most commonly asked by your readers or the client that you are conducting a feasibility study and report for. Some of the most popular ones are going to be, why is it important to consider these alternatives? What are the important features of the alternatives being presented? Are the criteria reasonable and appropriate? Are your facts being presented reliable and from reliable sources? What are the overall conclusions about the alternatives you're presenting? And what are your recommendations, or what would you do in our situation? So the structure for the feasibility report is pretty simple. It's going to begin with an introduction. Here you're going to want to discuss the importance of the alternatives you're presenting, why they should be considered, and potentially their impact if the client chooses to take them on. The second section is going to be an overview of the alternatives. Here you're going to want to thoroughly describe each and every one of them, their pros, their cons, their background, basic information like that. The third section is going to be the criteria. You're going to want to explain why the criteria are reasonable and appropriate for your client. And the fourth is going to be the method. Just like any research report, you're going to want to describe the reliability of your facts, where you sourced them from, what your process was, etc. The fifth is going to be the evaluation. Again, like any research project or report, how do the alternatives stack up against your criteria? You're going to want to thoroughly do an analysis and evaluation of them. Last but not least, we have conclusions and recommendations. You're going to want to sum up your conclusions that you've drawn about your alternatives and explain what you recommend or suggest, and then give an explanation as why you chose to do so. So before writing our reports, we want to define our communication goals, just like with anything in our field. There's two goals to keep in mind here. The first is usefulness goal, and this is to provide an easy to use form of information and advice its readers need to make the decision. The second is going to be persuasive goal. This assures decision making for the readers and provides a solid basis for decisions that they must make. There are plenty of tools to assist in the goal making and goal achieving processes along your way. Conducting research. Research goals must be defined in alliance with communication goals, as they're essential to achieving greater communication goals of feasibility or persuasive reports. A few things to note here. It's very important to gain a full understanding of your reader's criteria. Um, just like with any client, you want to fully grasp their mission, their goals, their vision for their company, the position that they're in, where they're looking to go, and things like that. You want to investigate the pros and cons of the alternatives being considered and presented. Um, you need to know what you're talking about when presenting a report like this, and you need to not be biased. So you need to present both the pros and the cons, how each may benefit um, your client. When conducting research for a feasibility report, you must consult several different sources and forms of information. Again, this goes back to reliability of sources. It's important to ensure that everything is credible, and the information that you're providing your client is reliable and correct. Um, the fourth one here is, again, avoiding bias. Um, just want to be clear and concise about that. And the last one is going to be utilizing visual presentation of data to facilitate easily digestible material. Oftentimes, these reports can be very heavy and dense, with a lot of numerical information. Just with anything, you want to incorporate graphs and tables, imagery to express the messages and data that you're trying to get across. Planning. The most important decision when creating a feasibility report is going to be the organization of content between the introduction and the recommendations. So essentially, we kind of go back to the burger feature of this from elementary school. There's exemplary tools for organization, and obviously everybody has their own, but here are a few to note. You want to have 5 middle sections, because this allows for each of the elements discussed to be designated their own explanation section, which in turn allows for your reader to fully grasp what you're explaining. Treat each decision as its own. This distinguishes each decision being made and allows for it to be explained separate from the others. Again, allowing for further understanding and digestibility with this. From a reader's perspective, this method allows for designation of information and processing. So easy to read, easy to understand. The information is all on its own in its separate area, and your client is really able to kind of delve into each individual section. Single decision with different research methods. So when you have a decision that requires different research methods than the rest that are within your report, you want to distinguish this. So in doing so, it allows for your reader to understand and categorize the different factors at hand. For example, if you used one method with a specific decision, you want to explain that within that context, as opposed to combining them and mix matching different decisions or alternatives and multiple different research methods within that. That's going to get confusing. So clarity is of the utmost importance here. Planning in a reader-centered way. Feasibility reports can be compiled in multiple ways. The most important tool here is to consider the way in which your reader wants to view the report. So this bounces back to understanding your reader and your audience and your client. It's going to get you success, and you need to know who you're working with, who you're reporting to, and understand the way they like to receive information and what works best for them. Drafting and revising. Just as with anything, drafting and revising should be a main priority when creating a feasibility report. And both of these things should take place throughout the creation process. After you write one section, edit it, revise it, draft the next section, and bounce back and forth between the sections of your report. This is going to ensure accuracy and ensure that nothing is missed over, whether it's grammar or organization or a fact that you misinputted. You always want to ensure accuracy when presenting a report or any other written work to a client. Major elements. The greater majority of information you have on drafting communication pieces applies to making feasibility reports. There's a few different things that we want to specifically consider for feasibility reports. First is the introduction. You want to answer your readers' questions. This often kind of goes hand in hand with answering intake questions from a meeting and understanding what they're looking for prior to beginning your study, your research, and your report. Just kind of getting an overall grasp on what they're looking for. Identify the issues at hand and explain how you plan to present solutions. So when you met with them prior to conducting this study, what were they trying to target? What issues were they trying to solve? You need to touch back on these and show that you had a thorough understanding of them. Touch on the alternatives being discussed in the remainder of the report. So you kind of want to give a little bit of an explanation or a tease of what you're going to be presenting throughout this report so that they have a general idea and can kind of get themselves in the mindset before continuing through the rest of your report. Criteria. Explain your research process and the standards you implemented. Why did you do what you did? 2 ways to present your criteria. Devote separate sections to identify and explain them, and integrate presentation of criteria in other areas of your report. So you don't just want to talk about your criteria in one section and then not touch on it again. There should be a consistent theme throughout your report. Be sure to present criteria early in your report to ensure your audience has a full understanding of the rest of the information you're reporting or offering. Do not forget to cite and state your sources properly. This is very, very important. Just as with anything, credibility, reliability of source information must always be correct. And you need to do your research prior to stating and or using factual evidence. 4 common types of criteria. The first is effect of course of action. The second, implementation of course of action. Then comes affordability and desirability. Crafting major elements, continued. Method, just as with any research report, your method section must vividly explain the way in which you conducted your research, why you chose to do so, and the results you received. Overview of alternatives, providing overview of the alternatives you have landed on, how you got there, why you think they suit your client, and why you've chosen to include them or suggest them. Evaluation of alternatives. This section should provide the pros and cons of the results of your research. Organize your most important points to be presented first, and don't include or dismiss unsuitable alternatives. This is left up to your judgment at the end of the day, but you need to remember that your audience always comes first, and you need to abide by ethics and morals. Also bounces back to bias. You need to present both the pros and the cons to your client within your report to ensure that they see both sides of the scenario. Moving on to conclusion and recommendation. This section sums up your report and outlines the suggested recommendations you have for the reader. It's going to kind of wrap everything up, so you want to make this as juicy as possible. Anything else you have left to say, maybe some other insight that you found or suggestions that you may have, implement it here. I think that clients are always very open to suggestion, recommendation, as you're the one who did the study and conducted the report. So just make sure you tighten everything up at the end there. Remember, you have a lot of the information needed to cultivate a feasibility report. Kind of goes hand in hand with a lot of the other work that we do, but always keep in mind that your reader is your first priority at the end of the day. That's the most important. Thank you.